Hello once again, and welcome back to Lessons from the Table. I'm finally wearing a different shirt because it is a different day to when I recorded the last 4 videos. Today I want to talk about something, again, that kind of relates to something I talked about a couple of weeks ago now, which is balance. And again, balance being such a hairy topic in Dungeons & Dragons. I think there's a lot to unpack here, but this has certainly been my experience trying to address what people mean when they talk about balance in Dungeons & Dragons. And this is one that I find comes more from the player side of things. D&D is not a video game. It does not balance like a video game. And I know I talked about like the balance of classes relative to one another and how that doesn't necessarily apply and all that kind of stuff. There is another way that we use the term balance in video games, and that's when we're talking about things like team compositions and parties. If you've ever played any competitive multiplayer game, if you play Overwatch or League of Legends or WoW Arena, like whatever you happen to play, right? There is an idea of what makes for a balanced team composition. So this even applies to, cooperative RPGs. There's this idea that you need to have, a frontliner who can dish out some damage, a tank, someone who can take a lot of hits. You need some backliners that deal high amounts of damage, but are maybe a bit squishy, the proverbial glass cannon. And the thing is, when you've got that preconception, you can look at the classes that exist in D&D and see how those concepts apply. A sorcerer is very obviously a squishy backline blaster for the most part. A barbarian feels and plays a lot like what we'd think of traditionally in video games as a tank. They can take a lot of hits. But it doesn't really work like that. Not in the exact way, because D&D is not a video game. These are not definitions that exist in D&D. The player's handbook does not say these classes are tanks, these classes are DPS, these classes are healers. It just, frankly, doesn't work like that. Some players will struggle to get that out of their heads, because these days, a lot of people play video games, and there is a significant amount of crossover between the sort of person that would play a competitive video game that's class-based and the sort of person that might play Dungeons & Dragons. So you will come across a lot of this, and you'll come across people who have played video games their whole life and are only just getting into Dungeons & Dragons now, and they will carry over certain preconceptions, or rather misconceptions. And I actually have one player in particular who I often go back and forth with about this, and this is a really tricky kind of issue, because there are places where you can see how these things do apply to D&D, which is why it's hard to understand the ways in which they do not apply to D&D. So let's just dive in and start unpacking this whole thing, right? In a lot of video games, let's take World of Warcraft, because that's one that feels much more RPG-like than, say, Overwatch does. In World of Warcraft, if you're queuing up for a dungeon, you need a healer and a tank and some DPSs, right? And that's a balanced party composition. There's that word, balance. This idea of a balanced party composition, a well-rounded party composition. Now, that's the more interesting word, well-rounded, because that's what people mean when they talk about balance in Dungeons & Dragons. What they mean is well-rounded. They mean we've got a party that's got some people who stick in melee and can take a couple of hits and dish out a couple of hits. We've got people who sit on the back line and provide utility. We've got people who can heal party members up when they go down. We've got people who can provide social skills in out-of-combat situations. We've got people who can help us navigate the wilderness. We've got people who can help us disarm traps. I'm basically describing a party that's got like one of each class at this rate, right? And that would be well-rounded. That's what people mean when they're talking about balance in Dungeons & Dragons. They're talking about the well-roundedness of a party composition, because let's be completely honest, if you've got a party of 5 people who do the exact same thing, you are going to have a very hard time, because they are extremely one-dimensional and not very well-rounded. Are they unbalanced? I don't think so. The reason I don't think that is because I, as a DM, can just design combat encounters that are still perfectly winnable for them. Okay, cool. You don't need to go into this having this idea of, oh, I need a balanced team composition. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. If your party's already got 4 wizards and you want to play a wizard and your DM is okay with that, play a wizard. Don't sit there and go, oh yeah, but we've already got all these wizards. Maybe we need a barbarian. Maybe we need someone who sits in melee. But what often people will be thinking when they're thinking that, they will use a very particular word. Maybe we need a frontliner. That's where we go away from skills and utilities that a character provides to a party and into roles that a character or a class fulfills. I do not like the idea of roles in Dungeons and Dragons. That is a big misconception. And I think that's what a lot of people who are familiar with video games muddy when they move into D&D. They think about parties in terms of roles being fulfilled. Okay, we've got someone with high charisma and all these social skills, which means we have the party face role covered. And it's that extra little step that causes the problem. If you look at it and you go, okay, good, this party's got someone who's got a bunch of social skills. That's going to be helpful for having a well-rounded party. If you didn't have anyone like that in the party, you could still play the game. You could still get by. It's not actually a problem to not have that thing. It is not a requirement. You do not need the quote-unquote role of party face filled just to be able to play Dungeons & Dragons, much like you need the role of tank to be filled to run a dungeon in World of Warcraft. Dungeons & Dragons does not work like that. And a lot of people kind of miss that because they're thinking about roles from video games. They don't understand where it does not apply. Now, I know I keep going back to the same notion, so I'm going to pull some examples from a recent game of mine. And a lot of these are going to pertain actually to the particular player I spoke of earlier who has a lot of these misconceptions still. And I spend a lot of time going back and forth, sort of explaining some of this out, right? And it can be hard to get the language right because it seems like a subtle difference between saying well-rounded and balanced, but one means video game, the other just means well-rounded, versatile, jack of all trades, can do a little bit of everything. Between the group, all bases are covered. And really, every team in life needs to be well-rounded. In a kitchen, you want people who are incredibly good at all different parts of culinary arts, because then you have a well-rounded kitchen crew and you will be an effective restaurant. You're not sitting there going, we need someone who really knows how to cook fish, otherwise we don't have a balanced kitchen. We don't have a balanced chef composition. Doesn't work, does it? So why do people keep applying it to D&D? Well, it's because D&D feels like a video game. It is incredibly similar. A lot of video games take their inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons. And now, I would argue, vice versa. There are parts of video gamification that have made their way into Dungeons & Dragons, and I think for the better. But going back to the point now, so here's an example recently from my campaign. 3 characters all died, all at once. They were a druid, a rogue, and a monk. That was basically all of our melee characters obliterated in one fell swoop. The party got in over their heads, and these characters died. It happens. It happens in my games, that's part of it. When everyone was rolling up new characters, I had a real problem. Because one of them rolled up a cleric, one of them rolled up a warlock, and then the last person to roll up his character is this guy who, often has this misconception about party roles. And I had a really unfortunate conversation with him because he said, I want to play a wizard. And I said, might not be a good idea to play a wizard. I'm not going to stop you necessarily, but we already have a wizard and a sorcerer and a warlock and a bard that sits on the back line. And we have a cleric who's not going to be going up front too much. And he said, so we need a frontliner. And I said, no. It's not that we need a frontliner. It's that we have nobody who is competent in melee. And he said, so a frontliner. And this is where the problem arises. He was too busy thinking about frontliner as a role that the party needs filling. A role that exists in Dungeons & Dragons. There are backliners and there are frontliners. And I know I just used the word backline a few seconds ago, so, forgive my transgressions. But you understand what I mean. People who do not sit in melee is what we mean by that. And when we say frontline, what we are trying to say is people who do go in melee. The fighters, barbarians, rogues, etc. of the Dungeons & Dragons world. But it's also not that cut and dry, is it, right? A rogue and a monk want to be kind of disengaging a bit more. They want to be darting in and out. If you wanted to put a term on that, you would say skirmishing, rather than just sitting right up the front, basically, the whole time. But this person was too busy thinking about frontliner. And then they said, but I thought you said party composition doesn't matter. I thought you said there are no such thing as roles in D&D, and you can play whatever you want. And I said, that is true. You can play a wizard if you want. However, we are partway through a campaign now where some enemies are going to be melee. If this was at the start of a campaign and everyone was rolling up a spellcaster and nobody had an armor class of higher than 13 and nobody had any melee weapon capabilities, I would adjust the campaign accordingly, and we would set the expectation that most of the encounters are going to be beatable and melee enemies will be few and far between, and eventually the party will also develop other tools to deal with the enemies that get in melee with them when they themselves are not very equipped for that. I was already partway through a campaign. I can't just stop throwing melee enemies at the party. That completely breaks the immersion. That completely breaks the world. And more importantly, it breaks the expectation that I had already set with my players about what the campaign would be like. It kind of pulls back the curtain a bit too far. You know, the party composition, there's that word again, changes up a little bit. New classes, more spellcasters, less melee. And suddenly we're fighting different kinds of enemies because if we fought the same ones as before, we'd all die. And everyone feels that difference, and it's kind of unsatisfying. It feels like I'm going easy on them, which isn't fair. That's not what they came to my table for. They came for a relatively immersive experience where I'm not necessarily going to try and kill them, but I'm also not going to pull punches. I set that out in Session 0. I don't think Session 0 is inherently sacred, but I would like to stick to that expectation, because if I deviate from it, I could alienate players. So I'm sitting here talking to this person, trying to explain this all out, and they were still just not quite clicking with the concept. And I'll be fair, I think they still haven't. And that's not his fault. He's just played a lot more video games than he has Dungeons & Dragons. And there is enough in Dungeons & Dragons that seems to reinforce these preconceptions of roles existing in Dungeons & Dragons. And the thing is, you can even argue that they do. Hell, we use those terms all the time. The fact that we say party face, that's a role. Party face is a role. That's not a class. That's a role. It could be fulfilled by a warlock with Mask of Many Faces and deception and persuasion as skills. It could be fulfilled by a bard with Charm Person and those same social skills. It could be done by a paladin. It could be done by any charisma-based caster that's got high enough social skills that, or charisma stat even, that their proficiencies allow them to deftly navigate most social negotiations and situations. And we would say party face. But that's not fair, right? That doesn't make any sense when you really think about it, because we're trying to find a particular role. A warlock and a paladin play very differently. A bard and a warlock play very differently. You could have a swashbuckler rogue that ends up being the person that does most of the talking for the party because they've got the highest charisma stat, right? It's just whoever does most of the talking. That's what we're really saying, meaning rather, when we say party face. But because we say it, we reinforce the idea that D&D has roles. Here's another core mistake that the same player actually made. This is when they were playing their monk character. They expressed to me after one session, they said, I'm not having a lot of fun in combat because I just keep going down. And I feel like no one else is willing to engage in melee with me. And I went, well, why do you think that is? And he goes, well, they're all ducking in and out of combat. And I kind of feel like I have to frontline. And there it is again. Everyone else was ducking in and out of combat because that's what they wanted to do. That was the ideal pattern of play. The ideal pattern of play for the rogue was to go in, land a hit, and back out so that they were relatively safe. He was a monk. The pattern of play for a monk should be somewhat similar. And if you do need to stay in close, patient defense is real helpful. But if all you ever do is stand up at the front with nobody else around you, with patient defense running, eventually hits are going to get landed. And they're all going to get landed on you because you're the only one in melee. And he said, I felt like I have to be the frontliner because nobody else is. And that's where that misconception came back in. He thought that because no one else is doing this particular thing, no one else stays in melee the entire combat, someone must, because that is a role that needs to be filled. We need to have a frontliner. We can't just all be skirmishers. All our melee characters can't all just duck in and out, because then who's going to sit there absorbing hits? Well, no one has to. It's up to me to balance around the party to an extent. And it's also up to the party to assess what they do and don't have, what they can and cannot do based on the breadth of abilities between all of them, and adjust in combats accordingly, and even out of combats. If there's no one with any kind of nature and survival skills, navigating through the wilderness is going to be harder. They've got to figure out how to make that work between them. If they've got nobody with high enough strength to move a boulder, they've got to figure out how to navigate through certain parts of the world where strength is going to be a necessary skill. If nobody is particularly charismatic or persuasive or convincing, they're going to need to figure out another way to negotiate through situations. Every party will, and indeed should, have some weaknesses. The only truly well-rounded party is one where you've got one of every single class. And even then, you might still have deficiencies, because if the bard plays a swords bard, and the rogue plays a swashbuckler, you may end up having two quite similar characters in terms of the function they serve for the most part. And this is where these misconceptions all arise from. We think about D&D in terms of video games, and we see the parts that reinforce that, rather than assuming off the cuff D&D is not a video game, and that even though these terms seem similar, they are not the same. If we go about it that way, we get a much better understanding of the game. And we do need to talk and think in these general terms of well-roundedness, rather than saying party composition, function that someone serves, rather than role, or indeed play style rather than role. A monk that does dash in and out of combat, makes use of disengaging and having high mobility to quote-unquote skirmish, to use the technical term, not the role term. That's their play style. They're not fulfilling the role of skirmisher. That doesn't exist. There is no role. If you open the player's handbook, there is not a single page on it where they list the classes and then the roles. Those don't exist. There is no tank, frontliner, DPS, healer, support, skirmisher, bruiser. Those don't exist, and get them out of your head. A paladin can deal damage and take damage and also heal. Are they a healer, a support, a tank, a DPS? They're a paladin. None of those other words apply. They're just a paladin. I know this has been a bit of a rambly episode, and again, a bit of an anecdotal one, but this is a problem I personally come up against quite a lot, and I imagine a lot of other DMs do as well, because we're all playing D&D in the same time and in the same context with a lot of people who are much more familiar with video games than they are with Dungeons & Dragons. If you yourself are struggling with this concept as a DM, I hope this video has kind of helped you maybe readjust how you think about the game. And if you've got players that have these same issues, well, I hope it's given you some tools to maybe talk to those players and help them realign their own views on Dungeons & Dragons as well. That's going to be it for this week. I do have a few more episodes all coming up and ready to go in the next couple of weeks as well, so do stick around for those. And thank you very much for watching. See you next week.